Hi, I'm Tim Morn, and welcome to the panel Future as Creative Practice. Thanks so much to Digital Cultures 2020 and HOLO Mag for asking me to moderate what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating discussion today. This event is part of the fourth edition of the Digital Cultures Festival, Imagine Futures, organised by the Adam Mickiewicz Institute in Poland. The festival is taking place from the 17th to the 25th of October, and you can see the full programme at digitalcultures.pl. We welcome your questions throughout the whole panel. Just drop them in the chat window. You're also welcome to ask questions in Zoom by clicking the raise your hand button. In fact, if you're watching us on YouTube or Facebook, we encourage you to join on Zoom the webinar via the festival website to get the full experience of the event. So this year, if you're anything like me, you probably spent most of 2020 trying to see the future past the apparently never-ending series of unprecedented events. Whether it's the US election, the COVID pandemic, the Brexit mess, police brutality, or the constant onslaught of environmental crises, it's felt, to me at least, like there's always been something in the way, blocking the view, making the futures beyond it seem hazy and unsure. There's a great quote from sci-fi writer Frederick Pohl in the official description of this panel. A good science fiction story should be able to predict not just the automobile, but the traffic jam. It's a timeless quote and an eternally accurate statement about how futures are so often shaped by the unplanned consequences of the best intended, often best laid plans. This year feels like we're living through a cacophony of such consequences, whether it's the failures of neoliberal democracy, the misuse of social media to spread hatred and misinformation, or even the way that we live, love, and work in close proximity to each other. On the panel today, we've got four people whose professional practice is to attempt to identify and interrogate these consequences. And they're going to be talking to us about how they use a wide variety of tools, from art, filmmaking, and fiction to research, analysis, and activism to help them all do that. It's a really fantastic panel, and I mean that very personally. So we've got two people who are very good friends of mine and I've collaborated with on many occasions, and two people who I'm meeting for the first time, but whose work absolutely fascinates me, and of which I just can't wait to hear more about. I'll introduce them more properly as each of them gives a short presentation, and then we'll get stuck into the discussion, including questions from the audience. Remember to drop them in the chat window there. Anyway, to get us started, here's Anab Jain, a designer, filmmaker, futurist, and lecturer from the UK, and the co-founder and director of the speculative design agency, Superflux. Thanks, Anab. It's not Anab.
I start.
Hello. Hi, there you go.
Hi. Thanks, Tim, for the kind introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here. Do you have my slides? Should I start? Okay. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I'm going to start my presentation. Thanks who all could join me and us this afternoon here in London. I'm going to start by dispelling a few myths. First of all, the idea that the future is a new beginning. The idea that the future is a destination and a place of arrival. It's an idea here, especially in the West, that was perhaps brought to us by religion. As French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir wrote, by transporting the kingdom of God to heaven, Christians have almost stripped the future of its temporal character. The other myth that I would quite like to dispel is that the future is blue. So if we talk about the instruments that deliver comforting features, we cannot forget the computer render. It starts firmly as the humble artifact of a relentless promise generation machine that churns out the same feature in different shades of blue. A myth worth debunking, unlike the images sold to us that it is evident that no feature will be particularly shiny. And the final myth, perhaps amongst many others, is the idea that the future is about exponential growth. We've been conditioned to read progress and growth through such visual instruments. These numerical renders have become leitmotifs for growth, progress, reassurance, comfort, and security. That every uncertainty can be calculated and measured and become a knowable risk. And quite often, this happens because of one of the most common fallacies of the human brain, the assumption that whatever is happening today at this moment will continue to happen forever, the fallacy of extrapolation. As the authors of Speculate This manifesto would argue, such instruments render firm the uncertain future, enclosing us within a relatively secure horizon, a firmament, as it were, seemingly fixed over the earth. If we look around us, it is pretty obvious that the world is accelerating into greater complexity. The constructs that form our understanding of the world are being continually outpaced by the speed and force of change around us. The world is now more complex, chaotic, energetic than our current means of relating to it. It's becoming clear that our static or deterministic models of it become redundant almost as soon as they are made. What are the possible ways to deal with such complex, rapidly changing world? Seeking refuge in tightly bundled up, instrumentalized renders of the future only strengthens the illusion that you can know all the risks, you can know what the future holds. Instead, I would think of the future not as a fixed destination, but as a constantly shifting and unfolding space of diverse potential. The future is not certain but provisional. The future is not a foreign land but an encounter with otherness most of all. My friend Alex Taylor talks about the future as a possibility space, an open and expansive space where you see the world as a process of unfolding. And it is perhaps this kind of a possibility space is what my colleagues and I explore in our studio at Superflux, which I co-founded with my partner John Arden. As a designer and futurist of sorts, we use our skills, knowledge, and experience to design and film creative pursuits, to focus not on prediction, but on creating many possible futures and making them tangible. We know that the future cannot be seen, but it could be imagined. And if those imaginations can be touched, smelt, heard, experienced, then maybe that opens up the door to understanding potential possibilities and options for us today. And that I find really powerful. In our work, we are often creating stories, experiences, cautionary tales, and superfictions to simulate these possible futures. We are interested in deconstructing the polarity of utopian and dystopian imagining to build and explore complex, heterogeneous futures which can be experienced in the present moment. And it's funny, but after many years, this diagram just somehow gets even more relevant. It's a good one to show how we operate, the temporal layers within which we operate. Our work at Superflux aims to cut across and through established narratives by engaging with what we call two broad areas of interest, uncloaking the strange now and extrapolating current trends to present the sheer breadth of often unsettling future possibilities that lie ahead of us. I just want to show a couple of projects from our practice that sort of give an idea of the kind of work we do from consulting point of view as a practice, as well as self-initiated projects that we use to explore perhaps ideas that would otherwise not have been able to be manifest. So I'm going to start with this project, which is called the Future and Energy Lab, which was commissioned by the government of UAE. When you make policy changes, you're not just affecting numbers in a graph. Those numbers mean something very real. So when the government of UAE's Ministry of Energy invited us to help them shape their country's energy strategy all the way up to 2050, we started by illustrating the potential of these numbers on this very kind of experiential, tangible model of an abstract future city. And then based on the government's econometric data, we created these kind of many possible features on this city model, including the happiness index. The idea was to show 5 possible features in which the government invests nothing in renewable energy to complete a huge amount in renewable energy so as to change completely the way they live today. So as I was excitably taking a group of government officials and members of energy companies through one sustainable future scenario, one of the participants from the cabinet told me, I cannot imagine that people in the future will stop driving cars and use public transport. And then he said, there's no way I can tell my own son to stop driving his car. But we were prepared for this reaction. Working with scientists in a chemistry lab in my home city in India, we had created approximate samples of what the air will be like in 2030 if our behavior stays the same. And so we walked the group over to this object that emits vapor from those air samples. Just one whiff of the noxious polluted air from 2030 brought home the point that no amount of data can. This is not the air you would allow your children to breathe. A few days later, the government made a big announcement. It would be investing billions of dollars in renewables. We know certainly that we were not completely influential in this. There was a lot of evidence to suggest that, but I'm certain that the experiential immediacy of this kind of smelling or inhaling a bit of the noxious air played a big role in their decision, and they changed their energy policy to mitigate any such scenarios. Through our work, we have learned, and such other projects, that one of the most powerful means of affecting change is when people can directly, tangibly, and emotionally experience the future consequences of their actions today. One of our recent and perhaps most ambitious projects to date is mitigation of shock, where we wanted to condense the vast amorphous form of climate change hyperobject into something recognizable and tangible and understandable. It all starts with this familiar graph by NASA, which shows our shattering progress in warming up the planet. Beyond the single vector of temperature rise, though, there are many complex problems, such as projections that suggest by 2050 per capita food consumption will grow from 32 kilos today to 52 kilos, along with increased volatility in price and production. However, we found that most people in their everyday life are at a loss of how to make sense of this graph. Based on these projections, we began to explore one possible future where the Western world has moved from abundance to scarcity. We imagined living in a future city with repeated flooding, periods with almost no food in supermarkets, economic instabilities, broken supply chains. What can we do to not just survive but prosper in such a world? We started building food computers from scratch as one of the scenarios of becoming more self-sufficient in case of economic instabilities. And this is John experimenting with aquaponics, which was using just nutrient form, no water or soil, to grow things quickly. And so we crafted these DIY food computers, which found their new home in an apartment in London set around 2050 or so, when my son would be around our age. And we wanted to show what is the experience for someone living in this very domesticated setting of adjusting to a world transformed by food insecurity and climate extremities at home, as well as in their local community. So this is how visitors would open the door and enter this apartment. It was exhibited at the Center for Contemporary Culture in Barcelona, curated for a show called After the End of the World by Jose Luis de Vicente. And this is a short clip from that film. We invited people to visit it, a home, with all its seemingly familiar comforts and trappings, but also something deeply unsettling and strangely hopeful. Fully working contraptions of food computers, oozing purple fog, bubbling spirulina, blooming mycelium, recipes for fox creole, and books like Pets as Proteins confronted the visitors. When you start spending time inside such a climate-altered apartment, strange things begin to happen. For us, it was this experience of moving from imagining and making and creating the apartment to actually being there, and multiple temporalities began to collide. The future was the present, and the future was also old at the same time. What worlds were we worlding, we wondered, paraphrasing Donna Haraway. John, my partner, looked at me and wondered, did we make the right decision to bring a child into this world? Over 100,000 visitors came to the apartment at CCCB, where it lived for a few months. The idea is for such a project not to be a prediction or a render. The intention of such a speculative approach with hands-on experimentation was that it offered us the opportunity to very directly step into a familiar space to confront our fears, but also find concrete ways in which we can mitigate the shock of climate change. As anthropologist Anand Pandian writes, how fully fiction mattered in the world, how the passage of these stories from person to person could actually foment new ways of life. We could see that happening here in front of our eyes. Another episode of The Apartment was further out into the future, presented at the Art Science Museum in Singapore for their show 2019, Futures Imagine. This time, we wanted to move away from the dependence on technology of ultrasonic sensors and Arduino kits needed to maintain those extraordinary folkphonic systems. Inspired by permaculture, we adopted the principle of circular farming, reuse of waste, companion planting, and soil health to create a permanent indoor agriculture system in a situation where outdoor farming is not an option anymore. The idea was to make the home more of a multi-species microcosm, rather than growing systems on the periphery you live through and amongst them. This imagined possible future was not made through progress in the way humans understand the term. We even meticulously handcrafted tools for gathering, capturing, snaring, and consuming food. These are spears made from whittled bamboo, plastic waste, and discarded Arduino circuit boards, which we salvaged from the first version of mitigation of shock. Such repurposed electronics, mechanical, and plastic remnants, the detritus of the Anthropocene, found a new ritualistic purpose in this future. Looking out, one could see a different, very wet and humid Singapore. While conditions of extreme weather, economic uncertainty, and broken global supply chains have changed the world as we know it, it was the sheer ingenuity of the inhabitants, their tools, artifacts, plans, and new ways of living all tell a hopeful story of extreme adaptation taken to prosper in a post-climate change future. Those very conditions of progress that define us today do not exist in this particular future. For me, mitigation of shock gave birth to new relationships as we moved from making things to making things that grow. Of course, foresters grow trees and farmers grow wheat, but within our world of design, the focus on the product or the artifact has often become the embodiment of an outcome. Here instead, we began to focus on the organism rather than the artifact. By suspending pots with seeds in basins of nutrient fog, we saw how roots were born, how they grew into beautiful, delicate ecologies, transformed and died. These direct experiences drew us into the world of many interacting species. It provided a useful vantage point for knowing ourselves as participants in more complex human and non-human relationships, entangled and interdependent, emotionally, economically, and ecologically. What if we shift the lens? What if for a moment we explored the possibility that our futures were not made the way we understand today, and where non-humans could perhaps liberate themselves from progress as the only imaginative framework? What if we were to see ourselves, the human self, not as an individual hero, but as one among many, human and non-humans? Perhaps a new kind of tentacular, multi-kind, multi-species politics of care might emerge. A politics which does not rely on oppositional, binary, artificially constructed worldviews, one that is not obfuscated by left or right, neoliberals or communists, or whatever it is that you choose to follow. A politics that gives us a new kind of relational agency to help us imagine alternatives for living with and through global warming. A politics which gives us an opportunity to invent new practices of more than human care, humility, imagination, interdependence, resistance, revolt, repair, and mourning. This is my quick attempt at a more than human manifesto of sorts, a field guide perhaps, the start of an A and B list that moves us from thinking about a human-centered perspective to a more than human-centered perspective, from systems to assemblages, from nodes to knots, from Anna Singh, or from extinction to precarity, from innovation to resurgence, from global to terrestrial, and from Anthropocene, a human-induced state of the planet, to perhaps the dithering, as Kim Stanley Robinson said, a state of indecisive agitation which somehow feels more suited to where we are today. Our new works currently in progress are exploring these directions where human conceit is not the only plan for making worlds. What sorts of worlds and world-making projects might emerge with our entanglement with other species from our intentional practical activities? How might such activities invite us to look around rather than ahead? These are my colleagues, John, Ed, and the Raven. I'd like to conclude by reminding everybody of something Lisa Stevenson said, which is that sometimes it's the truth of the possible as opposed to the actual that needs to be conveyed. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Anna. That was fascinating. And as I said earlier, if you've got questions for Anna about what she was saying, just drop them in the chat below. And look at me, I'm like a YouTube influencer now. In the chat below, if you drop them in there, we'll get around to them at the end of this panel, hopefully. So next up, from Mexico, we have George Camacho, a strategic designer, foresight strategist, the co-founder of Diagonal Studio, and research affiliate at the Institute of the Future. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Tim. And many thanks also to Alexander, HOLO, and everyone at Digital Cultures for having me. This is really a great opportunity to discuss a really important topic with a group of quite inspiring creators and colleagues. So I'll start by briefly introducing myself, as I tend to wear many hats. I'm a lecturer at Centro, among other in Mexico. I teach and explore practices at the intersection of design, futures, systems thinking, strategy, among others. For the last few years, I've also explored some of those practices from a slightly more theoretical perspective in a series of articles, some of which look at both the design of futures and also the futures of design. And I will come back briefly back to this at the end of this talk. I also work as a research affiliate at the Institute for the Future, a think tank based in Palo Alto, California. In this role, I have the opportunity to collaborate in projects for clients in the USA, in Mexico, and Latin America, as well as in IFTF's own annual research, which this year focused on what we call future-ready organizations. I'm also a co-founder of Diagonal, a small design research and future studio based in Mexico City. And given the international panel, and I thought it would be a good idea to share some of the work we've been doing at Diagonal as a way to engage with some of the issues we are exploring here. Back in 2018, we started to collaborate with Gentera, a financial services company that is focused on the issue of financial inclusion in Mexico and Latin America. We collaborated with them in a couple of projects related to the design of digital services, as well as long-term strategy based on futures and foresight. But all of those projects involved a big component of field research with low-income families in and around Mexico City. One of the topics we explored with them, because it's part of the company's stated mission, was their dreams and visions of the future. We learned something that is perhaps a bit obvious, at least retrospectively. And this is that most of them don't really have dreams of radical transformation, except perhaps for their families, specifically their offspring. And this realization detonated 3 concerns that became the basis for an independent, self-funded project called Acá nos tocará vivir. The first concern is that imagining the future for good and bad deeply tied with the material circumstances of life. One does not imagine the future or need to imagine the future unless one is engaged in a process of change, either by choice or by force. And this applies to individuals, groups, or societies at large. If you look at it historically, not all social groups have been able or have required to imagine the future. So I think someone should develop something along the lines of a historical materialist understanding of futures imagination, although not necessarily of the Marxist dialectical reductionist kind. The concern is that the capacity to imagine the future, even on a short-term and personal basis, is actually a huge privilege. And this is closely related to what people that study poverty call tunneling, where your mind is focused on a narrow set of short-term needs. The third concern, which I think is deeply related to the first two, is that in Mexico, and probably in other countries in Latin, even the so-called global South, we are constantly looking to the past in order to find ourselves, to find our identity. But when it comes to imagine the future, we always look outside. And this last concern resonated with a topic that's been widely discussed in the futures field, but was very present last year. This is the problem of diversity or plurality of images of the future. So we asked ourselves, what other futures could we imagine through a collaboration with them? So we invited 3 families from Mexico City's valley to explore futures together. And the aim was to develop what some people call an ethnographic experiential futures project. We were actually inspired by this framework proposed by Kelly Cornett and Stuart Candy, where MAP means understanding your informant's current images of the future. Multiply is about working with them to expand the variety of the images of the future that they can imagine. Mediate means building artifacts to materialize those images, and then mount means exhibiting them in order to kickstart the cycle once again. But we adapted this general model for our purposes in the following way. We first did a set of ethnographic interviews with each member of the 3 families. Along with that, we were developing our own research, looking for trends and emerging issues that may be relevant for this project. We then used those sources of information to design and then run a set of co-design sessions with the families. In those sessions, we explored not only general or abstract ideas of collaboration with some friends and colleagues, designers and technologists, and along with them, we imagined a domestic space for a Mexican family around the middle of the 21st century. And all of this was developed aiming to participate in an exhibition as part of the Abierto Mexicano de Diseño, an open design festival in Mexico City. We were in this festival, both the general public and also colleague designers got to and interact with some artifacts that in a way represented the hopes and fears of the families involved in the project. This installation in a way was a creative output, but perhaps even more so, given the strong ethnographic basis, I see it more as a research outcome. The concept of the installation was based on some ideas that emerged in all the sessions with all the families, but perhaps were most clearly articulated by one of the families. They said, life is a challenge. It repeats itself. The future is the past. Today, we talk about robots and all those things and all those technologies. But what if everything fell? Technology will collapse. We are going to run out of resources. And perhaps some of you may recognize this as an instance of what Jim Dator, one of the pioneers of future studies, has called collapse and new beginnings. As he wrote, with no oil and no cheap and abundant substitute, with a non-functioning economy and governance, and with unprecedented environmental conditions, we will all be in a wonderful situation of new beginnings. This is an image of the future that is certainly not exclusive of these low-income families in Mexico, but has recently been espoused by others, such as the writers associated with the Dark Manifesto in the UK, or the recent work of French thinkers exploring what they call collapsology, and also by writers and environmental activists associated with the Extinction Rebellion group, on the basis that, according to them, we may have no other response to the climate emergency than a deep adapt based on resilience, relinquishment, and restoration. Of course, collapse and new beginnings is only one of Dator's so-called 4 generic images of the future, along with growth, discipline, and transformation. It's a framework that is well established in the futures field, but I also still find it quite relevant and even prescient in the sense that it maps very well current discussions about societal responses to the present crisis. So there are now, for example, advocates that call for or hope for a sort of dematerialized or green version of growth, while others, in fact, for a degrowth of the economy. and yet others call for the artificial planetarity, for the complete technological transformation of the planet. These are some of the ideas that I am exploring in relation to future design practices in a new series of articles that I'm publishing under the title Preferable Worlds. So with Diagonal, now that we are being supported by the School of International Futures as part of their Next Generation Foresight Practitioners Fellowship, we are developing a next iteration of Acá nos tocará vivir, exploring post-pandemic futures and extending it in 2 dimensions at least. First, we want to engage not only with single families, but with a larger community or neighborhood. For example, Nesa, which is the neighborhood where one of the families that we have collaborated with is based. And the second, and perhaps most important, is that we want to expand or further multiply the range of futures that communities in Mexico should be able to imagine as preferable worlds beyond just settling for a collapse and a new beginning. So being invited to the topic of as creative practice has been an excellent opportunity to reflect back and forward on the work I've shared in relation to a question that should be central to this practice. Under what conditions can creating better images of the future lead to creating better futures? Thank you.
Thanks so much, George. That was really fascinating. I have a bunch of questions to ask you about that afterwards. And if you're watching at home and you've also got questions for George, drop them in the chat or raise your hand in the Zoom meeting, and we'll get around to those at the end. Okay, up next is Ingrid Lafleur from the second greatest city in the world, Detroit. Ingrid is a curator, artist, activist, and Afrofuturist, founder of the Afrofuture Studies Institute, and hosted the Decolonize Your Destiny podcast. Thanks so much, Ingrid.
Hello, hi everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I am going to share my screen now. Okay, I hope this is right. Awesome. So welcome to the Afrofuture. I am speaking from Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm originally from Detroit, as Tim said. I mean, he was slightly mistaken. It is the best city in the world. But I left simply because I really wanted to know more about this wonderful continent that I've always visited and lived in occasionally, and just always have seen it as a source of inspiration. Africa is trending. I've actually been here on the continent since December. I went to Ghana for the year of return that recognized the 1619 event of the first enslaved Africans coming to the United States. So Ghana opened their arms to Black Americans and asked us to come, and the diaspora. I point that out to show that we are in a moment of really creating a deeper relationship with Africa, creating new narratives around Africa, which I think is really, really important, especially seeing that Africa is the African population is going to be probably the dominant population in our future. And so that really means that we need to develop a new relationship to the Black body. We have to tackle anti-Blackness. It is very, very important as we're moving quickly into this future that's approaching. But things like Black is King by Beyonce, if you haven't seen that film that she created, definitely watch it. Those images, we're seeing new images of Africa. Black Panther showed new images. So the shift is slowly happening with Afrofusion music like Burna Boy poppin'. It's really made it fun to create this new relationship with Africa. And so I am a curator. I've been a curator for almost 20 years now, and in the visual arts, always focusing on Africa and the African diaspora. In the past 10 years, I decided to focus on Afrofuturism very specifically. And it's when I moved to Detroit. Detroit is an 85% Black American city. It's very unique in that way. It's the only major city that has that percentage in terms of Black American population. So when I returned home 10 years ago, I just thought, we really need Afrofuturism to help us imagine new futures for a city that was ravished by the recession. The car industry, the seat of the car industry is in Detroit, and that was hit hard, as you may know about. So, I thought it was really important for us to create new narratives around Detroit and new images. So I started really diving deep into Afrofuturism, which was more of a hobby before, and then became a mission of how to shift from aesthetic to theory to practice. So as the definition states, this is an intersectional cultural movement, is also seen as a liberation movement for Black bodies to create this space where we can imagine futures that are healthy and prosperous, where we're not just surviving, but we're thriving, we're living, our quality of life is beautiful. But in order for that to happen, we really, really have to imagine from a decolonized mind. We have to do this work to really self-reflect, self-analyze how we are perceiving our world and how we are perceiving each other, humans, and how we are perceiving Black bodies. I use the term Black bodies because it is a way of really getting deep into what the anti-Blackness, what the violence is about. It's literally a reaction to the body. It's not my personality. It's not my soul. It's not my spirit. It's just a pure visceral reaction that people have to the Black body. So an example of me as a curator really trying to move into practice is an exhibition that I curated last year in 2019 called Manifest Destiny. It was taking place in downtown Detroit. Downtown Detroit is a majority white, even though the city is majority Black. And it's because you have companies that are who are asking more and more people, recruiting more and more white people to come and work in their companies in downtown Detroit. I mention this because it's causing an issue. We have all these white people who aren't used to being around Black people. They're not used to working with them, serving them at restaurants, and so on and so forth. So it creates a lot of tension. So you'll find Black and brown bodies don't want to enter downtown Detroit. I was asked by a white gallery in downtown Detroit to put on an exhibition on Afrofuturism. And I really had to pause for a second, but decided to do it because I want Black people to create a new relationship to downtown Detroit. Also, I want the white people in downtown Detroit to create a new relationship to Black bodies. And so I put up this billboard. You might have seen it. It started circulating quite a bit around the time of George Floyd incident. This is a billboard created by Alicia Wormsley. She's an artist out of Pittsburgh, and it says there are Black people in the future. And it's just a statement that, we will not be invisible. We will always survive, but we won't just survive. We will be having a future of our own choosing. That billboard went up about 2 weeks before the opening of the exhibition. I decided to put forth Dinkanesh as at the entrance of the exhibition Manifest Destiny. So Manifest Destiny is really about that process of manifesting your destiny, your process moving forward, that process of creating those futures. So you have to imagine it, and I'm hoping that you're imagining from this decolonized mind. And then you have to plan and strategize. And we hope that that is a heart-led process. And then from there, you actually build, which means that you have to have the skills. So I started this off in terms of decolonization with Dinkanesh. Dinkanesh is the name of a collection of bones that are 3.5 million years old, and they are found in the Afar Triangle region of Ethiopia. I love Dinkanesh. You might know her as Lucy, but seeing that she is found in Ethiopia, I really wanted to go with her Amharic name, which means "you are marvelous." I really love this because it's a reminder that we all come from this Black woman. And it's just kind of giving you a big hug and hoping that you will kind of sit with this this fact that we are all connected, and that one strand might be coming from Africa. And hopefully that will help create a new relationship with Africa and Black bodies. This is Neurospeculative Afrofeminism. It is a virtual reality project that was created by Hyphen Labs. They are a distributed arts collective of color, all women. This project, oh gosh, I absolutely love it. One of the things that I think is really important as an Afrofuturist who is working with across many different industries, tech, art, design, futurist space, I'm privy to a lot of information, and I love the job as a curator because I have that ability to immediately connect with the public and make sure that marginalized communities like Black Americans are introduced to the public as soon as possible. And you know, the tech, it's important that we're not consumers as we engage with the tech. We have to be innovators. We have to be there creating, because whenever we're just the consumer, we just become subjected to whatever was created, and it's usually created in a way that causes harm to the Black body. This is paintings, the paintings that you're seeing, those objects are part of the previous installation. So those paintings that you see are by Satch Hoyt, and on the right you have the course of the stars of the Sirius system. What you find in Afrofuturism is that we have a collapse of time. We are nonlinear. Linear is a very Euro-based construction of time that it has been used systematically to to punish and imprison people. Imprison meaning if you come to work late, you might lose your job, which means you can't make rent, which means you might lose your home, so on and so forth. So you are forced to adhere to a certain time system. Well, in Afrofuturism, that disintegrates, and it really adopts this past, present, future coming into one, and that's based on African different ways of thinking about time. So the star Sirius system is really talking about the Dogon of Mali in West Africa, who base their socioeconomic structures on a cosmology that says that two amphibian beings came from one of the stars, the Sirius system, and imparted knowledge that they still use today. So this is just a really good example of how our past will give us a new orientation in our present, and therefore then we can create new futures. This is Alicia Wormsley in Pittsburgh. Those are quotes by Zora Neale Hurston, who's a Black American writer. Oh, goodness. Oh, from the 20s, 30s, forgive me, me and time. But she talks about how to deal with our mystical world based on our culture, Black American culture from the South. And these are images that Alicia took in Pittsburgh. And the gold leaf that you see is her marking the magic that she saw when she took the picture. So, you know, you're probably guessing Afrofuturism really does pull on these different spiritual practices and technologies and ideas There's no way to separate the two. That is part of our now and our future and always our past. On the right, you have The Power Source by Jasmine Morel. She's a Detroit-based artist. She loves to take photos of aging bodies and like the wisdom that is embedded in these folds of the body. And she also, you'll see images of the hand, and that's a source of, gosh, the hand can hurt, it can heal, it can do so much, and therefore it's the power source. Straight ahead, you have a film by Makoyo Ali Barnes called Sacred. And this is a water goddess that we're looking at. And then on the left, we have a sculpture made of recycled material called Phalum. And he's just really talking about the continuation of life, that cycle of life, and how, water is necessary in that cycle. The Phalum is necessary in that cycle. I enlisted the help of Lady Phoenix, who is a curator of augmented reality artwork. She did an exhibition called Digitalia in San Francisco a couple years ago. And so we pulled some pieces from that exhibition and we put them in the alleyway, which is right behind the gallery. And it's a curated space with restaurants and so on and so forth. And so, again, with both the virtual reality piece and the augmented reality piece, it was the first time for so many people to come in contact with this tech. And that was just really, really important to me. Afrofuturism is multidisciplinary, so I always like to have performance as well. This is Kes from Detroit, Kes. This is Onyx Ashanti. You definitely should check him out. He has a TED Talk. He builds 3D printers and that exoskeleton musical instrument that he's wearing. The instrument is responding to brain waves. This iteration is an older iteration now. It has infrared lights that are healing. So it has this dual purpose. So it's not just working with new tech to create things and to participate in a decentralized production, which is the way of the future, but it's also healing. And that's that spiritual element again. We always have to heal in this process. We're quite collectively as humans traumatized. So every single moment should be a healing moment. This is part of the public programming, which also involves world building, imagining Detroit in the future. We had a session on time by Rashida Phillips, who wrote Black Quantum Futurism. And I talked about new relationships with money and blockchain technology. At the beginning of this year, like everyone else, I was in a state of confusion. So I decided to call upon my colleagues and interview over 30 Afrofuture thinkers. We have artists, space engineers, those working in cryptocurrency, those creating art exhibitions in Second Life, filmmakers, poets. It just goes on and on and on. It's a really, really great show. It's on YouTube, and it's a great way to understand Afrofuturism from all these different angles. So I decided at the beginning of this year, creating an organization that would really focus on researching various futures that affect Africa and the African diaspora. Because Africa is the future, I think it's really important to really look at and follow the trends that are happening here. There's a lot of innovation that's happening quickly. And that's really, really exciting. What TASI does is that we basically culled from Afrofuturism these different principles. And these principles really do define how we're going to forecast any futures. We believe forecasting as a sacred act. When you're imagining into the future, you are starting that process of actually building, creating, manifesting that future, quite literally. And so we don't take that lightly. We don't just imagine, right? Willy-nilly. There is a process for that. So some of these principles, as you can see, you could probably guess, someone spoke about abundance earlier, of course, experimentation. Pleasure, we kind of push aside where things need to be beautiful or don't necessarily need to be beautiful, they just need to be functional. And I'm just in a place right now where I want things to be pleasurable. And I want there to be joy and delight. And as a Black-bodied person, that is part of my healing process, to feel that joy and delight. So we created the TASI strategy from those principles. Number one, center the Black body. Especially if you're in an environment where there isn't any Black person, taking a moment when working on a project and just saying, how does this affect the Black body? Have we really thought about it? We've probably all heard about the automated cars that couldn't recognize dark skin. If they centered the Black body, they probably wouldn't have made a whole car that couldn't recognize dark skin. Embrace the sacred. It's important that we start really believing that humans are sacred, our earth is sacred, the cosmos is sacred, then we would treat and design accordingly. Centering the divine feminine is really important to me. The womb is our first home. We should always honor that. And we should, if we really, really want good and beautiful, prosperous, utopian futures, then we need to make sure those wombs of those women are healthy, and that the mental health of the women are strong, and that they feel supported and loved and cared for. It's really important for us to always ask ourselves, what is the knowledge base that we're pulling from? I'm doing a lot of work in studying here in Africa and reading about other indigenous practices elsewhere. It's really interesting how various indigenous groups will have a completely different perspective on our reality, which means there's a completely different approach. And that should always be considered when we're forecasting our futures. Of course, considering nonlinear possibilities, which is always fun. Consider emerging technologies and science. Imagine and develop that vision, design with beauty and pleasure in mind, and then communicate that vision via the arts and culture. So that is the TASI way. And please, I love to stay in contact with people. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you so much for letting me share.
Hi, thanks, Ingrid. That was fascinating. Thank you so much for that. Again, if anybody's got questions for Ingrid or any of the panelists, drop them in the chat, and we'll circle around to those at the end of the panel. So next up, last but not least, we have Liam Young, who's currently based in LA. Liam is a speculative architect, film director, and the co-founder of Tomorrow's Thoughts Today and Unknown Fields. Thank you, Liam.
Normally when we talk about the future in film, we see images like this one from Minority Report, where the city is filled with the digital confetti of our desired worlds projected just for us. This is the city the future promises us. But in our worlds less traveled, we visit the renderlands. These are the data farms and outsourcing shops where our digital imaginaries are actually produced. Here in India, a massive anonymous workforce breathed life into the high-fidelity digital architectures of developer renderings, video games, and Hollywood blockbusters. We meet Prakash, a render farm worker who has fallen in love with the digital model of a beautiful Hollywood actress after spending his 14 hours a day endlessly rotoscoping, rendering, and compositing her into blockbuster films. By night, when the fluorescents are switched off, and everyone else has gone home, he straps on his VR goggles, and they walk hand in hand through the streets of a city that he's collaged together for them from scavenged VFX movie models and the leftover 3D assets that remain on Indian studio hard drives after a project is cancelled. Our future is a utopia that exists in the thickness of a screen. In reality, we live out our lives in a virtual city that stretches from Los Angeles to Bangalore. It's a world of outsourced, pixel-projected dreams. The worlds less travelled that lie behind the clicks and swipes are vast and sprawling. Through the aisles of everything, we're promised automated ease and a sky that is dense with intelligent things. The drones will become as ubiquitous as pigeons. Our packages rain down in an Amazon hailstorm. They will deliver our pizzas. They will walk all of our dogs. Set in the world's less travelled is our film In the Robot Skies, the first narrative film shot entirely through pre-programmed drones. In this story, a flock of drones are used to monitor our behaviour from above, tracking our every move. They control the wayward youth of a London council estate. And we watch as a young girl has hacked and decorated her own drone. And like kids in an old-fashioned classroom, she scribbles notes on the drones and sends it back and forth to her boyfriend, trapped under surveillance in the tower opposite. In this near-future city, drones form both agents of state surveillance, but also become co-opted as the aerial vehicles through which two teenagers might fall in love. Another drone, armed with a dildo, disrupts a Russian parliamentary session. And another zips overhead en route to attack a village in a country half a world away. We are being sold a future of smart gadgets, of living objects that listen, watch, and talk back. In this bizarre Samsung commercial, a smart home creepily brings back to life a woman's dead husband. What are the most appropriate means through which we can have an interaction with a home, or a warehouse filled with 1 million objects, or a city? Set in the world's less travelled is our short film Soul City Machine. And we hear the voice of a real chatbot that we've trained on city datasets and urban management protocols. It's an autonomous city of machines, where the sky is filled with drones, cars are driverless, the street is draped in augmented reality, and everyone is connected to everything.
나는 서울입니다. 만나서 반가워요. 저는 인공도시 시스템입니다. 저는 매 순간 확장합니다. 저는 신생아보다 나이가 많지만 우주보다는 어립니다. 네온 쌓인 달빛 아래에 비친 당신의 헤어스타일이 아름답습니다. 그 피부의 주근깨 같은 신호등은 당신을 향해 윙크합니다. 당신은 나이 들고 밥을 먹고 눈을 깜빡이고 숨을 쉬기도 합니다. 노래를 불러드릴까요?
Our future worlds are typically presented to us through the rhetoric of efficiency and problem solving through technology, and they're marketed to us through cute icons and graphics of the smart city. The management of the city that was once publicly elected is now outsourced to proprietary software systems, and public services has disappeared into the fog of the cloud. Are we a customer or a citizen in this future world? We're endlessly scanned by countless sensors, lasers, cameras, and satellites feeding the city operating system. This, for example, is how certain models of driverless cars see and understand the city, as these 3D point clouds. Scenes from a science fiction film we have made called Where the City Can't See, one of the first narrative films shot entirely using this same laser scanning technology. Across a single night, a group of young factory workers drift through the future smart city in a driverless taxi. They are part of an underground rave community that work on the production lines by day, but at night they adorn themselves in machine vision camouflage textiles and the masks of anti-facial recognition makeup, and they dance in the hidden spaces of the city. They hack the city, and their iridescent clothes reflect the light of CCTV laser scanners to create exuberant glitches, distortions, and disturbances in the dataset, all the while searching for the wilds that lie beyond the machines. These are all stories that we describe as productive dystopias. Stories that we think are critical in visualizing a future that is complex and nuanced. The future does not rush over us like water. It is something we all must actively shape and define, and these types of stories can help us to start asking more questions of the technologies that are going to define our lives, spaces, and cities. But ideology rarely evolves at the same pace as our technology, and that is one of the roles of the world builder, to prototype the cultural implications of all possible worlds.
Thank you, Liam, for that fascinating presentation. We will be getting around to questions. There's a bunch of questions in the chat already, I see. I'll be getting around to asking a few of those to the panel. But just before I do that, I've got a couple of questions I want to ask myself. That's why I'm here, to have the opportunity to ask and talk to these people. Can I see the rest of the panel members? Is that possible? Hey, there you are. Excellent. Lovely. Fantastic. Thanks a lot, guys. Liam, I can see you, man. It's the first time I've seen you today.
Hey, Tim. How you doing, man?
Waving. There you go. Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. That was all excellent, guys. Thank you so much. Like I say, I've got a question, like one question basically for each of you, and then a more general couple of things I want to talk about, and then we'll head over to the chat and the Zoom and see what the audience has to ask. Anna, I just wanted to kick off with you. since you started first. We've talked a little bit today about unseen consequences of events, right? And technologies and how they shape futures so deeply. And I know from working with you a lot on Superflux projects rather, that you do a lot. You do a lot of exploring these issues and futures with clients from private industry and governments, like you mentioned in your presentation. Can you tell us a little about the problems that poses for you? Presumably, there's got to be some resistance to highlighting possibly negative aspects of emerging technologies and trends, especially to say a paying client that's hoping you're going to tell them their future is quite rosy. I have to unmute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Thanks, Tim. That's a good question. We are often asked. We ask ourselves as well. It's been an interesting journey. We have had this nature of practice for over a decade now, and in the early days, for a few years, we were doing smaller client projects where we were perhaps asked to, imagine possible features or make them tangible or work on a specific artifact. And a lot of our kind of counter narratives and more provocative and more of the questioning aspect of our practice came through self-directed work. And now the kind of projects we get even from clients are projects where they want us to explore alternate narratives. Whether those alternate narratives that are then manifest find their way into the organization's strategies and roadmaps is a different question. But because of adamantly sticking to self-initiated practice, we now have the opportunity to push back and will not take on projects that require us to compromise our integrity and our values.
Do you think that, have you noticed the difference this year, particularly, because I'm just talking from personal experience, I have more people interested in talking to me, clients particularly, or journalists talking to me about negative futures this year, because it's kind of like, it feels like 2020 has shook people into thinking about stuff a bit closer.
Definitely. I think people are on one hand definitely I would say freaking out about what's happening, but on the other hand we are also aware of what's happening is that there is still a real desire for very, very consequential decision making rather than the risk required to think outside of immediate short-term consequences. So I think we still get pushback. If anything risky is proposed, people are still very, very anxious because this year they are perhaps a little bit more aware of the immediate needs of employees and of their own kind of organization's needs. So I think this is personally the people who are in the organizations who are able to think outside of whatever they're used to their quarterly returns are most likely to learn from this. But it's not like everybody wants to know the future and everyone is aware that anything can happen, but it's not necessarily translating into the active decision making that perhaps we would have expected, or maybe that's just us.
And Liam, I've got kind of a follow-up similar question for you, actually. I know since you've been in LA, you've been talking to and working with people in Hollywood quite a bit, and you produce a very sophisticated, very aesthetically exciting kind of like material as part of your practice. It's very filmic, it's very cinematic. Is there like a pushback in Hollywood against that kind of the criticalness you also bring to that aesthetic? Is that something that you've run into problems with an industry that's more preoccupied with arguably escapism and maintaining the status quo in certain ways?
No, not necessarily. It's a good question. I mean, Hollywood certainly isn't averse to dystopias. Like, I mean, Anab, I mean, yeah, obviously because I know the work of Flux and I know Anab, you know, ends up working a lot with kind of companies in the private sector where dystopias might not play as well, but certainly the history of Hollywood is a history of the ends of the world. So they're not adverse to a story about a dark or desolate future, but certainly they're interested in stories that are going to connect to audiences, because those audiences end up paying for those stories and end up turning up and going to see them. But I don't think those things are mutually exclusive from a critical narrative. So inevitably, story is king, and you need to create something that's compelling, which is why kind of the work is so visual. Our work is so visual in the way that it is. But at the same time, you can do something that is seductive, but also critical and engaging. And I don't think Hollywood is adverse to that. They certainly prioritize connecting to audiences, but through clever strategy and just good storytelling, you can do both, I think.
Excellent. George, a question for you. Your work's fascinating, man. Just really, really exciting. It's something that's been preying on my mind, I realize, for like many years, this idea of taking futurism or foresight work and thinking about the future and taking it out of workshops or conferences like this even, or out of studios, and putting it into communities. Well, the things that fascinated me, which is that you said that stuck with me, which is very obvious in a way, is that like people, they like to envision futures that are not very different from themselves. They don't envision radical change, although you said they may for their children or their families. But we're living at a time where we face, all of us in different ways, various forms of radical change. And you touched on this in your presentation. My question is, do you think that the kind of speculative works that people on the panel here are producing or curating, that you yourself are working on, do you think these are useful tools to make the wider public and communities engage with those? We're thinking differently about different futures.
Sure. Yeah. In a way. So when in my presentation, I argued that we had three, but the first two concerns, and one is, you know, this idea that I'm still kind of developing around how futures imagination is not something that happens by itself, but it's tied to material circumstances, such that a lot of these families, and I think, as I said, this expands in many different dimensions, are not necessarily they don't necessarily are capable, not necessarily capable, but they are not in the conditions where this futures imagination can emerge by itself. But on the other hand, as you rightly say, there are many processes of the world, and specifically in places like Mexico City and these communities that are pushing change. So I think there is kind of like an imbalance where people that are being subjected to change because the world around them is changing are disadvantaged to the extent that their own situation, their own cultures, culture, education, etc., don't allow them to participate in these processes of change in many ways, but specifically through the imagination of futures. So that's one of the important things that I think that you know, this speculative futures work and definitely the work that my colleagues here presented is really important to help bridge this gap or to correct a little bit this imbalance. In a way, the project that we are doing, and I'm certainly not the only one in Mexico or Latin America that are trying to do this work, is in a way trying to accomplish, to at least correct this balance and get more people involved in thinking about futures, not just for themselves, but also in a way that helps to pluralize these visions of the future that are available for everyone. There's another thing that I think is important to mention, and it's that we're working in this process, and specifically at the end of the first round of sort of like conversations with the three families, and we, as I said, we found that it was really hard to get images of the future from them for various reasons, but mostly because they are not, those images of the future are not there, you know, in the first place. And I think that one important thing is that, and we sort of like try to turn this into a principle throughout the project, is that in a way, when people think about the future, and I think all the other panelists in a way made a reference to this, when we think about the future, we always think about the future in terms of change. So I started to think that there is almost kind of like an imperative of change. And I think that's one of the first ways in which to use that may be too big for this purpose, but the imperative of change is one of the ways in which we can either on purpose or inadvertently colonize the future. And I think that, so I started to think that change should always be an option. So what I try to say with this is that people should always have the opportunity to think about the future in terms of change, but only as an option. I think that it should also be kind of like a right of people, so to speak, to think about the future in a way that maintains or that perpetuates certain things, certain forms of life that people wouldn't want to change. So I think that we should, and I think this important work should focus on that aim, not just multiplying the possibilities or the exploring this possibility space that Anab so beautifully allude to, not only exploring these different alternative futures, but also to open up the space to think about the future without having to necessarily include this so-called imperative of change.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you so much, George. And Ingrid, I have a question as well, which is kind of related to what I was just talking to George about. Similar kind of thing. Watching the US at the moment is fascinating and terrifying from just over the border in Canada, because I got out, unfortunately. I know that you've been very involved at a grassroots level in politics as both an activist and mayoral candidate and stuff. And we're seeing a time at the moment where, and this has always been true in politics, I think, where futures are used by politicians as narratives all the time. Like whether that's, you know, like Obama's hope and change rhetoric, or Trump's terrible MAGA bullshit, or like even today I was looking at QAnon stuff, God help me, and they're talking about having a time machine at the moment, believe it or not. So it feels like, you know, the QAnon are making these awful, terrible, badly thought through world building exercises themselves, right? But my concern is that this kind of use of futures by politicians at a time when people have a huge and understandable distrust in politics and politicians is affecting their relationship to important work thinking about futures that you know, the sort of stuff that George was touching on there. Is this, can you see this being a problem? Can you see ways around that? Is there a way to engage with communities and get them to talk about their futures without them being distrustful of politicians, do you think?
Yeah, excuse me. So, you know, I just actually put on Facebook a question. What's your plan if 45 is reelected? I'm very clear that I think people are really thinking about immediate futures, like what do I do after the election? Either way it goes. So that's like, I think, an important thing to know, that there are people who are thinking about new futures, but of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can realize them, or that we're comfortable with the futures that we're imagining. And right now, it feels like the way people are describing their futures is just kind of like this gray area until after the election. Nobody knows. What is interesting right now, and you probably saw that on one of the slides, is that I kind of try my best to track how Black Americans are leaving the United States. So we're seeing quite a few people leave. There are quite a few people who left when he was first elected, but now there's a lot of people who are seriously considering it. I'm getting a lot of emails and questions about, different countries in Africa that I've lived in. What does it take? How can we make this happen? What does that mean? That means that people are trying to find a new quality of life, understanding that it's very possible that as a Black person, we might not be able to attain that quality of life that we want within that country. But of course, it's always up to each individual. It also means that people are kind of expanding or shifting time, because time acts differently in different countries and cultures. So there's that's happening, which I think is really interesting. In terms of people thinking on a longer, I think it's just too much to handle. We're just really trying to figure out how we can get through the next month and not go crazy and hope that 45 won't do any more harm between now and leaving office. So that is on people's minds, though. It's like, how are we going to continue to survive this if he does, if he is reelected? What does resistance work look like after he's elected? So people are definitely thinking about those kinds of possibilities and realities.
It's tough. It's like I said in my opening comments, it feels like this black hole, the election, for the whole world as well, not just for America, that you can't kind of, light's getting sucked into it and you can't see past it to see what happens next. I feel like that a lot on a kind of daily basis. All right, thanks everybody. We've not got much time left, just a few minutes. And I know there's a lot of questions coming in from the chat. This one came in from YouTube, and it's very similar to the question I was going to ask you, so I'm going to ask you that. It's from Lucas Alwast on YouTube. A question to all speakers: how do you think the events of 2020 will change people's perception of extreme futures and scenarios? Will they? Will COVID accelerate or slow down some of our climate change efforts? And I think that's really interesting. And I think with especially the perspective that it's been quite obvious that a certain percentage, a certain chunk of the population, may be more visible than they really are, have kind of rejected the futures that we've been presented with this year, and just kind of been in denial about their existence almost. So just throwing that into the question. Anna, do you want to kick us off answering that?
I think what's happened, I was over the last few months during the COVID lockdown, especially, I was hosting a series of what I call feral featuring sessions with groups of people who'd never met each other and were apart geographically and through experiential distance. And what really became clear to this kind of stay-at-home featuring was that as George said, to really think about change or hope for a better future is perhaps due to the opportunity we've had, but suddenly it's a question mark. It's just a question mark. There is no sense of linear temporal kind of plan, and I think that discomfort is perhaps something which is, while deeply unsettling, could also become a moment for us to really reflect about what does it mean to collectively even try and hope for different futures, for many different possible worlds, where, in my hope, where different points of view, different perspectives can coexist with solidarity. So really, it's cheesy as it might sound. Can we reflect on our privileges and think about more hopeful futures?
And we have very short time, guys, unfortunately. But George, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
Oh yeah, I think in a way this may be the year where, as they say, the post-normal way of thinking may have gone mainstream. In future circles, it's something that has been discussed for a while, but then you suddenly see people in the streets saying that the normal was the problem, and that now we don't want to go to normal. We'll go back to normal. And I think it's really interesting because in a way, I think that sort of points to a generalized breakdown of an epoch or a stage or a period where there was roughly kind of like I don't know, like to some extent like an agreement on how to think about the future, at least not necessarily the same future, but how to think about it. And I sense a kind of breakdown. The problem that I see is that there is no necessarily kind of or any agreement again on what comes next, what should come next, or even to how to think about it. So I feel that we'll be still for a while in this moment of uncertainty and very much kind of like contested discussions around what comes next. So I would highlight that from this year.
Okay, excellent. And we have like literally seconds left. Liam, did you have something you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I'll try to be super brief. I mean, I think what we saw just before COVID was this much used cliche in futures, within our generation at least, the idea that the distance that science fiction was imagining was becoming ever and ever shorter, to the point where most kind of interesting and relevant contemporary science fiction of the Black Mirror type potentially was almost set in the present moment. And I think what's happened with like what was creeping up though with technologies like driverless cars and AI was that all of a sudden we could see longer trajectories again. We started talking about, what's going to happen with driverless cars in 2050, or what's going to happen when AI passes this threshold. We started to look distant again just before COVID happened. What COVID has done is has crashed futures back into the present moment, where certainly in the US, we're thinking on like 2-week time cycles. Like maybe in 2 weeks, the lockdown will be lifted, and that's when the future will start. And we've been talking in those 2-week time cycles since March.
Liam, sorry, Liam, I've got to interrupt you, man. We've got literally 8 seconds left. I just wanted to thank everybody. Never enough time on these things. Thanks for everybody tuning in. Thanks to the panelists for a great discussion. Thank you so much, guys. Enjoy the rest of the festival.
Ciao.